So about a week and a half ago, I posted a blog called 6 Reasons Why Your Students Are Not Showing Up to Online Learning. And it got 120,000 views within 3 days, and it's continued to do well 10 days after. It came from a place where about 6 weeks ago, when this all became a pandemic, I found myself home quite a bit. I'm an author and consultant, and I'm usually on the road every week, and suddenly I found my presentations not happening, starting to go virtual in the future. A couple of friends invited me to 2 pandemic pages on Facebook for teachers and leaders. One has 140,000 members, the other one 60,000 members. And I kept thinking to myself, that happened over a couple of days. And it showed when you started looking at the comments and the questions, the stress that people were feeling, because this is pandemic teaching, virtual teaching, online learning. Those are things that take time and communication and reflection and practice. This is pandemic teaching and pandemic learning because it happened overnight. So when I started looking at the comments and questions, some of them were the stress people were feeling. Others were offering up tools. This is what I use today. A lot of them were about Google assignments kids were handing in where they were blank, and people were very, very unhappy with those. But I get it. There are all those things. And then they started asking about how to shoot videos. And what I decided to do, because I just couldn't get the comments and questions out of my head, is that I started to cut and paste them into an Excel spreadsheet. And at the time, I had about 985 comments. Yes, that's true. And I coded them based on work that I do around instructional leadership, a book that came out a few months ago. And that book is based on things like implementation or student engagement from a social, emotional, and academic lens, or instructional strategies and a focus for learning, but things like efficacy, something we're all experiencing right now, and then evidence of impact. But accountability came up quite a bit. And there were a lot of comments about how often do your kids appear online? What's your percentage? And there were people that had 10%, 50%, 95% everywhere around. And I started to think, what is the incentive for a student not to show up? Not the incentive for students to show up, but what's the incentive not to show up? I've been in school for 120, 130 days, and suddenly I find that I have a permanent snow day. I don't have to go to school. It was easy to say parents aren't making them and all that stuff, but why am I not waking up in the morning saying, I want to connect with my teachers. I want to know what's going on in class. So I started to think about that, and I came up with 6 reasons. Number one is the fact that access. We know that we are learning a lot about equity during this time. 30 million students qualify for free and reduced lunch. Common Sense Media says something like 10 million students don't have laptops. In school districts in California where I coach, they've got city buses coming in, and they're parking in different parts of the city for 2-3 hours at a time, and those city buses act as hotspots. So we know that kids can only get online at certain times. Essential workers was one of the things. If I'm now out of school, my parents are essential workers, and I can make money to help them at home, I'm an essential worker. School takes a back seat. We know that those things happen. And then a big one that happened all of a sudden within weeks of when this pandemic hit was that schools went to a no harm grading policy. And what I found is that as adults, we no longer had that control over students. And I mean that in both a negative and positive way. I was a teacher for 11 years. Proximity to students is a control factor. Peer pressure. I am a student in a class and my best friend's in there. They're doing the work. I want to do my work too. But also we have things like grading. Suddenly kids were not going to get a grade. And we started saying, well, if they don't get a grade, they're not going to show up. That can't be the way that we think, because it really has to be about what is the learning experience that we want to offer that is far past the grade. And I know that that's more complicated than a 5-minute video can ever do. But that's one of the reasons why the students didn't show up. Other times it was because they were taking care of their siblings. They're the oldest. They're taking care of their younger siblings, making sure that they get their work done so that older siblings doing their work at night. Is that great? No, it's not. But we're in crisis mode. So we've got to do all hands on deck. What's going to happen? That's why kids are not showing up. And then I said bedlam, no bedrooms. And the reason why I did that is because we know there are multiple families that live in one household. And those students don't want you to see what's behind them. And they know you're looking just like you're looking behind me to see what my office looks like. Not everybody has an office. Not everybody has a quiet space. So homework becomes something we don't do because it's just too annoying to try to do it because it's bedlam in the house. But the last one really struck a nerve, and that's where I talked about teacher-student relationships. If I did not have a good relationship with my students in the classroom in the brick and mortar structure of a school, then my students are probably not going to want to engage with me when it went over to virtual learning or pandemic learning. I surveyed students, and I've put blogs out about that as well, and I continue to survey students. It's very plain. If they didn't feel like they wanted to engage with a teacher in person, they're not going to engage with them online. So what I think about is this, and one of the reasons why I wrote the blog is to not point blame, because this is crazy. Teachers are working incredibly hard. They've got their own families. They're spending hours and hours trying to do things. But the reality is we do have to look at what is the positive that can come out of this. So I pondered some questions. How do we communicate with families? When I was a school principal, we had a 5-page newsletter that nobody read. So we condensed it down to one page, called it the refrigerator page. They hung it on the refrigerator, and I created 5-minute videos that I would flip out to parents in flipped communication. I focused on the day in the life of a kid during school, or even huge initiatives that were happening at the time, like Common Core Standards or the Dignity for All Students Act. One thing that taught me is that the families like to see our faces. There's some power there. If I'm a principal and you're a principal, how often are you connecting with your teachers to just check in to see if they're okay? How often are you doing virtual staff meetings? How often are you taking questions from them? And as a teacher, how often do your students get to see your face? Because on the student surveys I've done, students are saying, I miss my teacher, I miss my friends. So sometimes in a crazy world, we're looking for that beacon of hope, and your face is that beacon of hope for people. I've gone through trauma in my life, and one of the things that I've always felt is that as hard as it is, and as difficult of a situation as it is, I have to find something positive. And that brings me to self-efficacy. We know that efficacy is the confidence we feel in situations, and this is not a place where a lot of people feel confident when it comes to pandemic teaching. But this is the time when you can work on that. In fact, one of the things that contributes the most to raising self-efficacy is a challenging activity, and that's what we're in. So my thought is this: we're in pandemic teaching and pandemic learning now, but at some point we're going to go to a hybrid virtual learning experience. What are things you're doing right now that are working so well with students that you want to be able to use them in the future? And have you asked students what is working well? What are they telling you? What feedback are they giving you? What would they like to see happen in the fall, even if we're in a virtual learning experience again? And what are you learning about yourself? How are you digging deep and finding out about yourself things that you never even knew existed? Because if we lose sight of gaining some of the positives during a really tumultuous and terrible time, then we're going to lose sight of everything. And the reality for me is that so many of you are doing such great work. Start to hone in on what is working really well and what do you want to carry forward. There are 6 reasons in my mind why students aren't showing up. What are ways that we can turn it around so they do? Thank you for your time.